Okay, so now that we're familiar with how the basic pieces of a MERN-stack application fit together, let's talk about the application that we're going to be building. So we're going to be building a full-stack to-do list application. It's going to have several pieces. It's going to, of course, have a form up at the top that will allow users to create new to-dos, right? So they'll be able to type it in here and click on this button here and create new to-dos. Underneath that, it's going to have a list of all the to-dos that the user has created, and each of these is just going to have like the name, maybe it'll have the date, etc. that it was created at, and it's also going to say whether it was completed or not, okay? Additionally, each of these is going to have some buttons on it, one that allows the user to delete the to-do, and one that allows the user to mark the to-do as completed. And of course, there will potentially be a lot of these to-dos underneath it. Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward application, and it's an example that we've used in other contexts, but I've found that it's a really great example for getting an idea of how a full-stack React application works. Okay, so just to talk in a little bit more detail about how all this stuff is going to fit together, all of the data for our to-dos is not actually going to be stored on the front end. It's going to be stored on the back end. So what this means is that our front end, our React application, is going to have to communicate via network requests to our web server, right, which will also be managing our database down here. Okay, and it's going to have to make requests depending on what it wants to happen. So if it wants to load the data, it's going to have to send a request to that, and the server will send back that data. Okay. If it wants to create a new to-do item, it's going to have to send a request for that, and the server is going to have to send back some kind of corresponding data once it's created that new to-do. And likewise for deleting to-dos and marking them as completed. Now, we'll see how all of this works inside a React application very shortly. But first, let's create the front end of our application. Now to do this, we're going to be using Create React App, which is just the boilerplate generator that allows us to create all of the boilerplate code for our React projects. And the command we were going to run for that is going to be npx create react app, and then the name of our application. So I'm going to call this application to-dos front end. And I'm also going to add the use npm flag because I want to use npm as the package manager instead of the default yarn. That's just a personal preference of mine. If you prefer yarn, leave that off. Okay, so let's run this, and that will generate our React app for us. And just another thing that I wanted to point out as well is that you'll want to make sure you have some up-to-date versions of Node.js. Well, and first of all, you're going to want to make sure you have Node.js installed in general. The way you can check that, first of all, you wouldn't have been able to run the command that I just showed you if you didn't have it installed at all. But the way you check your Node and NPM versions is by typing node-v and npm-v. And your versions should be somewhere around the ones that I have, right? If you have something like Node 8 or Node 6 or Node 4, something fairly old, you'll probably run into some problems with some of the basic commands we'll be running here. So if you don't have these versions, I highly recommend you install an up-to-date version of those. Google is going to be your friend for finding that. And if your versions are higher than mine, well, that's great, right? Everything should work just like we want it to. So getting back to our front end, and we can see that the Create React App script has finished running. What we're going to do now that we've created that project is just change directories into it. So we're going to say cd to-dos front end, or whatever you called your directory. And we're going to open this up in Visual Studio Code by typing code dot, right? That only works for Visual Studio Code if you have it set up in your terminal. Otherwise, just do file open. And now that we have this open, let's just run it to make sure everything works by typing npm run start. That's how you run applications generated with Create React App. And that will open up our application in a browser at localhost 3000. So everything looks good. This is just the basic code included by the Create React App boilerplate generator. So let's go back here now and get started building out the front end for our application. So the front end is going to consist of 3 main components, and we're just going to create those directly inside our source directory here. So we're going to say new file and create those components. The first component is going to be the to-do list itself. Okay, that's going to be basically the component that surrounds and takes care of displaying each individual to-do item. Okay, so it'll be this border component here. The next one we're going to create is going to be the to-do list item component. This is going to be the individual items that we're going to be displaying inside the to-do list. I found it's usually nice to have a separate component for items inside a list. And the last component we're going to create is the new to-do form component. This is going to be the form up at the top of our component that will allow the user to create new to-dos. Okay, so now that we have these 3 components, what I want to do is just go into our app.js and delete everything that's inside of there. So we're going to just delete everything inside this return statement, and we'll just put a placeholder there to make React happy and say hello. Or you know what, let's say my to-dos, since that'll be the title of our application. Okay, and we can also delete this logo thing. You can delete logo.svg, since that was just the spinning atom thing that we saw when we ran our application. And that is the basic setup for the front end of our application. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.